Good afternoon, everyone. Planning Commission's in session. Ms. Rodriguez, would you do the roll call, please?
Commissioner Schwartz.
Here.
Commissioner Peugeot.
Here.
Commissioner Lodge.
Here.
Commissioner Jordan.
Here.
Commissioner Higgins.
Here.
Vice Chair Campanella.
Here.
Chair Thompson.
Here. Ms. Galarte, are there any changes to the agenda?
Chair Thompson, there are not.
Any announcements?
We have no announcements.
No announcements. Okay. Next item is a review of minutes of October the 1st. I will be abstaining as I wasn't here. Do we have any recommended changes or corrections?
Mr. Chair, I will also be abstaining.
Thank you.
I'll move to approve.
Second?
I have a motion and a second to approve. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? And abstain too. Thompson and Peugeot. Okay, the next item on our agenda is the potential home sharing ordinance amendments. Ms. Galarte.
Ms. Limon will be making the presentation.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair Thompson and Planning Commission. I'm Liz Limon with the Long Range Planning Section of the Planning Division, and we're here today to talk about a potential ordinance amendment to allow short-term home sharing rentals in the city. A little bit of background of the ground we've covered with the City Council in June and August of this year. At those meetings, we presented information to the City Council about the current definitions in the zoning ordinance of short-term rentals or transient stays, which are less than 30 days, and residential uses, which are stays of 30 days or more in a residential home. Council unanimously in June directed staff to enforce our existing zoning regulations that prohibit short-term vacation rentals in most residential zones in the city. Actually, all residential zones in the city, with the exception of the R4 multifamily and hotel zone and the commercial zones located in the downtown and waterfront. At the same time, they allocated significant funding to proactively enforce the full-time vacation rentals in residential zones. They also directed staff to explore with the Planning Commission on a concept level the idea of amending our ordinance to allow home sharing rentals, and I'll get into the definitions in a second. We wanted to start out at the very beginning to give a clear purpose of this meeting today for the Planning Commission, because it's a little unusual, it's a little different what we're asking you to do today. First of all, we're asking you to hold a public hearing and to receive the public comments on this topic. And then we want you to discuss on a conceptual level whether the city should consider allowing home sharing where you rent one or more rooms in your house in the city. Talk about the opportunities, the challenges, and the enforcement issues, which we'll cover in the slides ahead, and you will also hear from the public about this. And then again, on a conceptual level, we'll be looking for input to the City Council about whether this is feasible and whether an amendment like this could be scoped in a way that it would be acceptable in the City of Santa Barbara. So the three basic questions we're going to be asking you today at the beginning of the meeting and also at the end after we hear from the public is just on a super high-level scale, is a home sharing ordinance worth pursuing in the City of Santa Barbara? Again, currently our zoning says short-term stays of less than 30 days are transient commercial uses, and they're not allowed in our commercial zones. So if we were to change that policy direction in our zoning, is it worth pursuing after you consider the challenges and the opportunities we're going to present today? If you think it is something that the city should pursue, changing its regulations to allow home sharing, some that we'd like to hear whether you think it should be a planning permit with strong performance standards, which would be sort of the most restrictive approach. And again, we're looking for a yes/no answer to this, not how many days a week or how many people can stay or how much parking should be provided. All those details would be worked out in an actual ordinance amendment. What we're asking for you today is just concept, yes, no, do you think it should be regulated by planning? Or do you think it should be regulated through the business license and simply be a registration with the city, which is much less restrictive, but it is what some other cities do. And then the third primary question we're asking the Commission today is whether, if you think a home sharing ordinance is worth pursuing, should we require the host or the property owner or one of the primary residents to be on site during the stay? And again, not looking or asking for information on all the variations of that, just simply a yes or a no. So those are our primary objectives for today. Again, just to cover some ground that we covered with City Council in June and in August, our existing zoning defines short-term rentals as less than 30 days, rental of a room, home, or even in portions of a building for less than 30 days is a commercial or transient use. And those types of short-term rentals are only allowed in hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts, or other similar hotel-type uses. And those types of uses are allowed in our R4 zone and commercial zones of the city. And those types of uses, the short-term renting of rooms for less than 30 days, again, are prohibited in most residential zones currently by our zoning. For the purposes of discussion with Council in June and again in August, we as staff proposed a uncodified definition of what home sharing could look like based upon what other cities have defined. There's a few cities that have allowed home sharing, and we'll touch on those in a little bit. But again, for the purposes of discussion, in the staff report, we proposed this definition. It's not in our municipal code currently, and it's not in our zoning ordinance. And our definition was a home sharing rental is the rental of a portion of a dwelling unit for less than 30 days. And it's a primary residence, and the host lives on site and is, in a sense, an ambassador and hosts the dwelling unit actively while they're there during the entire duration of the stay. That's the definition that staff has proposed for discussion. You will hear today, and you've received correspondence, that there are many people who feel that that definition for discussion is much too restrictive. People are asking for us to consider, the city to consider a more expansive, inclusive definition of home sharing. What you've seen in the letters, and you'll probably hear today, is property owners want the ability to earn extra income by renting rooms short-term in their homes. Others are interested in renting their homes while they are out of town on vacation or work. We hear 2 days, 1 week, 3 weeks, the whole summer. Again, those are details that would have to be worked out in the ordinance, but you will hear that today. You will also hear people saying that this home sharing provides a unique visitor experience and enhances the tourist experience in the city of Santa Barbara and benefits local business and provides an alternative to traditional hotel and housing. And clearly, if we regulated and adopted a definition of regulated home sharing, it would be an increase in revenue to the city through the transient occupancy tax, or TOT. You will also hear today, and through the correspondence that you received, requests to limit or reject the concept of home sharing right from the beginning. We will show you in the future slides there are clearly extreme enforcement challenges with trying to regulate a home sharing arrangement and home sharing activities. We know to date it's extremely difficult to enforce on vacation rentals, the exclusive renting of an entire home. Home sharing takes it to even another level of difficulty and challenge in regulating activities that go on behind doors. You'll also hear from people today about the importance of preserving our residential zoning and our residential character, and that to expand the definition of home sharing beyond what staff has proposed is really opening the door to more transient activities in our residential neighborhoods. And again, you'll hear from people who are trying to limit or reject the home sharing concept that this type of activity in a residential zone is a significant policy change for the city zoning practices historically that have preserved residential neighborhoods and residential character. We have done some research into what other cities, comparable cities that are looking at home sharing ordinances. Clearly, the vacation rental concept is a very hot topic in planning across the country. Very few cities are beginning to look to the concept of home sharing as a possibility. San Francisco has been at it for over the last year and are having extreme difficulties, but for the purposes of this report, we are looking at the city of San Luis Obispo and the city of Santa Monica as more comparable in size and experience to ours. However, the city of San Luis Obispo is a much smaller number of units. It's a smaller impact in their city, but they have adopted a home sharing ordinance and they do prohibit vacation rentals. But currently, they have about 90 online listings for home sharing, and they've registered about 36 home shares. Santa Monica is much more close to ours as far as the numbers that they're experiencing and seeing. They currently have about 1,700, or they estimate 1,700 online listings for the city of Santa Monica. And in Santa Barbara, currently, there are over 1,000 listings online. The city of San Luis Obispo, again, prohibits vacation rentals citywide. They have, in the last, I believe it was a year and a half ago, adopted what they call a homestay rental program. They require an application every year, and they have performance standards. They specifically prohibit homestays in guest homes or second units out of the respect for the need for housing in that community. Santa Monica similarly prohibits vacation rentals citywide, and about 4 months ago, they adopted an ordinance back in April, actually, of 2015, that would allow home sharing. And they defined their home sharing activities as short-term rentals where the residents host visitors for a fee overnight. Santa Monica allows both renter households and owner-occupied households to conduct home sharing activities. City of San Luis Obispo limits it only to owner-occupied units. In Santa Monica, they clearly state that at least one of the primary residents needs to live on site and be in the unit throughout the entire stay of the short-term rental. Similarly to San Luis Obispo, Santa Monica said short-term rentals of guest houses or secondary units are not allowed, that those are an important part of their rental housing supply and are not available for short-term home sharing. And this is just a little more information on the city of Santa Monica, the type of performance requirements that they apply. So for the city of Santa Barbara, today at this conceptual level with the Planning Commission, we have a choice of rejecting a home sharing ordinance. Some of the reasons for not pursuing this is that, sorry, I got confused there. If we reject a home share ordinance, the illegal renting is likely to continue to happen. That's a concern. These are some of the concerns and challenges. If we do not adopt a home sharing ordinance, we wouldn't be able to apply any regulations or performance standards on these short-term rental activities in homes throughout the city. We would continue to have to rely on complaints from neighbors about enforcement if we leave our current rules on the books where there is no definition of home sharing. And if we don't regulate them, we would not be collecting the additional transient occupancy tax or revenues for the city. On the other side, if we do adopt a home sharing ordinance, the city would be able to require neighborhood notification that this type of activity, short-term rental, was occurring in the neighborhood. We would be able to set minimum standards and measures. We could require a complaint response plan be on file with the city. We'd have procedures for requiring closure of short-term rentals if there are repeat violations, and we'd have a way to increase our TOT revenues to the city. So again, to come back to the purpose of our meeting here today is to consider the correspondence you've received, hear from the public, and then talk about the opportunities, challenges, and enforcement issues. I didn't go into too much detail about the enforcement issues. I was going to leave that for the Planning Commission to ask us questions, but clearly it's a very, very difficult thing to enforce. And we've talked to both San Luis Obispo and Santa Monica, and they're both finding extreme difficulty in enforcing these issues. And we're looking for the Planning Commission to give input to the City Council about whether we should pursue amending our ordinance to allow home sharing rentals. A yes or no question. So just to come back to the three primary questions we're asking today, is the concept of home sharing worth pursuing in the city of Santa Barbara? Does it fit within our community and our zoning regulations? And if you believe that it should, which type of regulation should we do? A planning permit or business license and TOT? And again, if you think it's something the city should pursue, amending our zoning ordinance to allow, should we require the host to be present? And again, today we're just asking for a yes, no, not number of days, times per year, any of the details the ordinance would have to work out. And I'll come back to that slide after I finish my presentation, just a couple more. Our next steps is going to the City Council to provide them with the information that Planning Commission gives us today. And Council actually directed staff to come back to the City Council after meeting with the Planning Commission for a check-in to see whether they believe we should continue forward with the ordinance process, which takes a year to a year and a half to do. And here are some of the steps that would be involved if the Council directs us to continue forward with the home sharing ordinance. We would come back to the Planning Commission in early 2016 with a work session on the details of what a home sharing ordinance would look at. Then after that work session, responding to all kinds of questions about the different ways that we can regulate and how much we should provide incentives or discouragement for home sharing. We would then need a few months to actually draft the ordinance amendment, and that's a few months in early 2016. We would then, as staff, return to the Planning Commission with a draft ordinance and hold public hearings and receive your recommendations to Council. We would then move forward to the Ordinance Committee and Council adoption hearings in the fall sometime. Again, I just want to reiterate today is a concept review. We're really asking a yes or no. Is it worth pursuing? It doesn't bind you to whether the ordinance that's before you in the summer of 2016, it's not binding to what you do today. But I just think a good discussion of the opportunities and challenges would be beneficial to give to Council as to whether we should pursue this. And that concludes my presentation. Renee Brooke is here, and George Buell as well to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you. Any other opening comments from staff? Hearing none. Anybody have any of the commission members have questions for the staff? Commissioner Peugeot.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of questions for staff on the presentation. First of all, I believe this was clarified at City Council during their hearing, but maybe we could reiterate here in terms of what you mean by commercial, because I think it's for ease of discussion, you've broken this into residential and commercial uses, but I think I heard at the City Council meeting that by commercial you're incorporating all those non-residential zones when you're talking about commercial, right? That in some of your slides you talk about the commercial zones versus the residential zones and their allowable uses, but I think when you say commercial, you're not simply talking about R2 or C1, that kind of thing. You're talking about also industrial zones and whatnot. It's just a minor clarification. But I think that made some sense to me, and I think that was helpful at the City Council when you clarified it there.
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Peugeot, Yeah, a lot of our discussion at the City Council was focused on full-time vacation rentals. And so we prepared information and a series of maps showing where hotels are an allowed use, because hotels are where transient occupancy occurs, stays of less than 30 days. So anywhere hotels are allowed, short-term vacation rentals have the potential to be permitted as well. And so hotels are allowed in the R4 zone and in the commercial zones. And our current zoning ordinance says any stay of less than 30 days is a transient commercial use, regardless of where it's located.
Okay, that helps. Thank you. And then one of the key questions you have for us today is item 2. Should it be regulated by A, planning permits along with performance standards, or business license and registration? Do you have a few comments you can give us about how we should evaluate those trade-offs? And is there an option of doing both?
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Peugeot, excellent questions. Yes, we actually could do both, and this would be part of what crafting the ordinance would be about. And this is where we would need to roll up our sleeves with the Planning Commission, look in more detail at what other cities have done, and come up with a process that fits Santa Barbara. We could either require planning permits and provide definitions and a process in our zoning ordinance, or we could look to our business and license registration fee and treat it more on par with like a home occupation. But those are the types of questions that would need to be resolved during the ordinance amendment process, not today.
And but in terms of our basic questions for today, maybe as we get into the discussion, I'd be curious and have some thoughts, but I don't know if it's really the way it works, in what kind of tools and oversight each of those different types of permits might allow us for, to improve on some of the enforcement aspects. So, but we could bring that up later. I just think it's something that we should kind of eke out in the discussion if that's one of our questions.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Higgins?
To staff or maybe the city attorney's office, what's the, if you can share, what's the pre-council hearing where there was a discussion about the just an outright ban on vacation rentals? Maybe last year, for example, calendar year, what was the quantity? Can you give us some insight as to the quantity of enforcement cases or citations, or relative to the 1,000 or so that were on the market at one point, how many caused an enforcement case?
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Higgins, we've had only 8 enforcement cases in calendar 15. That number there will grow dramatically, probably exponentially.
And maybe the staff report touched on some of the challenges with enforcement, but I guess my question is, can you give us some idea as to what the staff time is involved in an enforcement case? A typical, if there is one.
Sure. Chair Thompson, Commissioner Higgins, I would just add that in terms of number of complaints we've received more than 8 complaints this calendar year, and zoning staff have followed up on a fair number of those. Those that are difficult to enforce, we refer to the city attorney's office. So I don't have the exact number of how many of all complaints we've received and have followed up on, but one of the most time-consuming things with these types of alleged violations is just proving that the actual activity has occurred, because we may see and people can say, well, there's thousands of ads out there, why aren't you following up on these? But the difficult part of that is we need to be able to prove that they have actually rented to somebody for less than 30 days. And trying to gather that evidence takes time. Sometimes the complaining party helps us identify certain periods of time that it's rented out more often than not, and we could try to actually witness it ourselves if we can. Otherwise, it's a lot of data collection on the internet, looking at the calendars, how they're booked, looking at guest reviews, and just it's accumulation of a lot of evidence, because no one thing may necessarily prove it very well for us, at least to have a good record established, that we'd feel confident saying they've in fact violated the municipal code.
One more. So if we take a certain direction, I guess today you'd be able to tell us which direction, to what degree that direction would affect staff time on enforcement. So that's maybe part of what I'm looking at is, depending upon which way we go or the city council goes, what are the staffing impacts to chase some of these violations?
Certainly, Commissioner Higgins, I think if we were starting to walk down a certain path with this ordinance, we could help provide input on what that would mean for staff to enforce that, whether it's upfront in confirming that what's submitted to qualify for home sharing rental, if it's a lot of upfront work with periodic check-ins for compliance, or whether it remains mostly an enforcement by complaint basis. That's a different type of way to regulate it. So certainly, I'd be happy to help answer those questions.
Okay, Commissioner Jordan, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Lamont, I too am going to have trouble with question number 2 for the same reason Ms. Peugeot did, because it seems to me that either one of those, whether it was something with a list of performance standards, like you give examples in the staff report, or if you had a business license and registration, you would still have an equivalent of a list of standards part to see whether the business license was being violated or not, right? I mean, in either one of those situations, you would have to measure it somehow. And so I don't really know how to answer that question. And I think more information there would be on what the differences are and how you would see the pros and the cons there. One question I have for that particular thing is, are the paths to enforcement the same? Do they start the same, whether it's example A or example B? Is it just somebody in a neighborhood complains, and then the path from then goes in the same direction with the same potential results, if it's a planning permit or if it's a business license?
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Jordan and Ms. Brooke might want to add to this. I think first of all, with question number 2, what we're trying to sort of test out is whether, if the city is to pursue a home sharing ordinance, do we want it to be permissive or very, very restrictive? For example, City of San Luis Obispo requires 1 off-street parking space in addition to having already met your current residential parking requirements. And in the city of Santa Barbara, that would be a very high bar to be able to meet. So we're trying to find out, if you want to pursue a home sharing ordinance, should we be making it super easy through the business license and registration and just subject to complaints from neighbors? Or should we try to highly regulate it, which brings enforcement issues and other issues as well? Clearly, the ordinance would spell this out. Cities that regulate it through the business license have a certain number of complaints received, and then your business license is revoked. Fairly simple, straightforward, none of the complications that are involved when you have zoning enforcement cases, as currently is the case. It's a much higher bar to try to prove that.
In that example, what are they using as the basis of making that complaint credible or not? Isn't it the same potential items that would be on the list of your performance standards? I guess you have multiple complaints for somebody who's just using the permissive example of a business license. So those complaints are what? That are in violation of what? Aren't those things, those components, still the same thing that could or could not be part of performance standards?
Yes, I mean.
Okay. So one is more, but when you say one is more restrictive, the list might be tougher in the performance standards than the list would be in the license part, the business license part, right?
Correct. And as both Commissioner Peugeot and you are saying, it's not black and white between these two. It can definitely be a blended approach. It would be a City of Santa Barbara approach, and these are the types of issues we would need to talk through.
And Mr. Vincent, I guess just taking that down into the weeds further, if you had either one of those situations, either you had a planning permit with performance standards or you had a business license and you had repeated procedural violations leading the city to want to terminate either the permission based on a planning permit or on a business license, are either one of those easier to stop the allowance of that home sharing operation?
Mr. Chair and members of the Commission, I would say that in either case, as far as stopping someone once they've already received their permit, it would essentially be a similar process. The due process rights would be similar in either case, in either construct, in the sense that once the property owner has established that right to be able to operate that home sharing business, in order to remove that right from them, the due process standards would be the same. The question to answer your question, there are distinctions between what evidence would be necessary depending on the nature of the operational standards, or whether they simply violated for some reason, if there was a operational standard that required the parking space. They prove up the parking space initially in order to get their business license, but then they remove that parking space by parking their own camper there or something, and so that they no longer meet that standard. That would be a relatively easy thing for us to prove up, that the parking space is no longer available. That would be a relatively simple thing. A more difficult evidentiary challenge would be if one of the standards is that in order to be qualified as a home sharing business, you actually are in presence. The owner is present throughout the stay, some portion of every day of the stay. I'm not sure where you would fall on these things, but that would be a much more difficult thing to prove up, because it would require somebody to be there to observe that individual, that property owner, being present and therefore satisfying that standard. So hopefully those two examples show.
And then staff cites, and this is in relationship to question 3 on somebody's presence in the house. Staff uses the example, the working definition of rental of a portion of the dwelling unit. And I guess my question back to you again would be, what's the definition of a dwelling unit as far as this would be applied? For example, if I have a house that's got 3 bedrooms, but I only need one of them, can I physically alter the interior of the house to make it inaccessible from 2 of the bedrooms to the other area of the 1 bedroom, not putting in more kitchen or whatever the right phrase would be so it doesn't turn it into multi-units? I know that's, but does that still, so I just have 1 kitchen. I've got 2 bedrooms over here. They're physically separated, but in the same dwelling from the 1 bedroom and the host's living area. Is that still a dwelling unit in terms of the use of the language here?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Jordan, the definition of a dwelling unit already exists in the zoning ordinance. However, I believe how we're going to slice and dice dwelling units gets into the weeds that Ms. Lamone was trying to avoid getting into today. The dwelling unit in your example, though, before you start cordoning off situations, that single-family home is already a dwelling unit. Right. The entirety of it is a dwelling unit. If one of those rooms was rented to a party who was not the property owner and not the family or the full-time resident of that dwelling unit, that would be a home sharing as long as the property owner was there for whatever defined period of time is necessary in order to have it as home sharing as opposed to a vacation rental.
Okay. I'm too far down in the weeds, I'm sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I think I'll start at the very top of what I consider some of the strategic questions here. Often, when the Planning Commission is asked to contemplate either a policy change or a new policy and or a project, staff brings to us, along with the City Attorney's Office, findings of compatibility. We have policy compatibilities. We have a whole host of policies in our general plan that we're asked to consider. What I would like to hear from staff and or the city attorney on today, because I did not hear this at the council, I did listen to that hearing on replay a couple of times, is whether or not entertaining or considering such a new policy is compatible with a number of key, prominent priority policies, especially I'm thinking of our housing element. And some of the concerns that were raised by Councilmember Hart address this issue in terms of the housing crisis. It's not pressure, it's not a crunch, it's a housing crisis. So I'd like to hear from staff about how you view that policy consideration for us in considering this type of new ordinance and this type of new policy.
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Schwartz, with respect to our housing element, we did raise with the City Council that our current housing element does identify vacation rentals as being something of concern in the City of Santa Barbara because we have seen such an extraordinarily low vacancy rate among rental housing, among all housing. And so with respect to your question, Commissioner Schwartz, yes, it's very concerning to staff. That's reflective of policy that's adopted by the City Council.
Okay. On one of my other questions, these are just top-line questions. I'm sure I'll have more after public comment. On one of the slides, it's the City of Santa Barbara slide. I don't know that we have a number for that slide. The first bullet starts rejecting a home sharing ordinance would, and then you have some sub-bullets under that, Ms. Limon. I want to ask you a question about the first sub-bullet, not necessarily stopping the illegal renting. And again, I want to go back to what I heard on council. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I did not hear the council discuss or entertain the consideration of prohibiting, allowing, as opposed to continuing to prohibit short-term vacation rentals because of a potential for runaway illegal use. So because I didn't hear that, I'm wondering why it would be proposed of Planning Commission to consider a recommendation for a new policy on this with an unintended consequence, let's say, of illegal renting, which we already have, when it wasn't considered for the enforcement that's going on by the City Attorney's Office for short-term vacation rentals. Why would we consider it today as to whether or not we're going to endorse or recommend home sharing? Do you see what I'm getting at? I don't know, Mr. Buell, if that makes sense, or Ms. Brooke?
I do. Thank you, Commissioner Schwartz. I do understand your question, and the reason we wanted to clearly state that is that to have a reasonable expectation that not regulating home sharing rentals does not mean they won't occur. So it's really just an expression, a recognition of reality, and that we wanted you all and the public to be aware, as we are aware, that we can aim to regulate land uses to the best of our ability and develop the best standards, but it's very difficult to actually prohibit people from doing things that they would like to do. Should they not want to follow the rules, of course, we would try to enforce on that. But it was really just a recognition of reality, and that may not have come up explicitly in the discussion, but I think it was recognized too, even at the council discussion, that we would be forcing people underground potentially.
I would also like to speak to that just very briefly. Although there wasn't any type of lengthy discussion among the City Council with respect to the prospect of illegal renting happening despite whatever prohibition may be in place, it's something that we did hear from the public numerous times in both hearings that took place in June and August. And we heard things such as, this is the new economy, this is reality, this is the 21st century. We have the technological tools and we're able to do this. And putting it in very simple terms, it really, from staff's perspective, if you're asking us to enforce, it really turns into the proverbial game of whack-a-mole, where we identify where the problem is and then it'll come up in another place. We recognize that we're in that right now with direction to enforce. I would also point out that there was very brief comment made by Councilmember Hotchkiss towards the end of the August 11th hearing, where he mentioned in very passing terms, but very accurately, is that this would turn into an enforcement challenge or nightmare or some term like that. And that's really, we're trying to reflect what we heard from the public and also generally what we need to hear from you today in terms of, and keeping this in mind. it would be a reality that we would be facing. It would be very difficult. We're in it right now, and it would apply specifically to home sharing in the context of today's hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Beal. I think my last question right now, going back to the slide that Ms. Limon put up, concept review, 3 basic questions. The third question, should host be present in the home during stay, yes or no? This prompts a couple of top-line questions in my mind. First, and I think some of my colleagues were getting at this with their inquiry of you, should this move forward, should we contemplate this and the council contemplate this, and a very robust permitting, monitoring, and compliance enforcement program be required? At this point in time, would staff and or the city's attorney's office or have you contemplated a proactive monitoring and enforcement, not a complaint-based reactive monitoring and enforcement program? And kind of the part B of that question is, if you have, what's the scale, what's the difference in scale with the resource requirement associated with a proactive, because some cities actually have a proactive, and that seems to me that would be a different undertaking and investment on our part. Ms. Brooke.
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Schwartz, we would do what City Council asked us to do, whether it's proactive checking in or enforcement, and that is possibly a discussion topic for you or council at some point. We've thought about a lot of different iterations here, but without knowing all the details of what we would be asked to enforce or what we would be asked to proactively seek compliance with, it'd be difficult to say how much time one would take versus the other. But I think that's, in part that gets to the second question really, is whether we're asking people to tell us up front how they're going to comply with all these performance standards and seek a planning permit or potential revocation of a business license if you don't comply with other certain standards. It's similar in that way.
I would also like to add to that and remind the Planning Commission, we're looking to you to give us guidance as to what you think might be the best thing for the city. And we will forward that recommendation on to the City Council. Now, keeping in mind, and it's an important consideration for the City Council as to how to allocate resources. It boils down to dollars, and that becomes a decision of the City Council. In terms of weighing the costs and things of that nature, that really isn't something that we'll be asking of the Planning Commission to give us guidance on, because that's something that the Council would be most involved with. If we recognize that whatever is recommended, should we be coming back through with a draft ordinance? If we recognize that the financial costs would be significant enough, we would be taking the ordinance through the Finance Committee as well. Because if the expense is large, they would want to weigh in considering that.
Well, certainly that's a council decision. I guess my underlying inquiry there, and this is what I've heard from the public, many members of the public are tired of having to do the monitoring of their neighbors and their neighborhood. And so this proactive versus reactive, I think, gets to the heart of community and neighborhood and some of the concerns that have come to the surface. So that's why I was asking staff if you'd contemplated, one form or another, one path or another in that regard. So getting back to number 3, and this really, we could do a deep dive on number 3, because our municipal code and our zoning is riddled with terms that some of which are defined and some are not, but I think they all have an important place in this discussion, because to simply assume what we all agree to as the definition of host or home and numerous other identifiers or descriptors, which I'll get to later in our hearing today, I think gets to the issue of, the who, what, when, where, and how it gets monitored and enforced. And in that totality, should it be something that we undertake? So in a way, this is tactical or on a more micro level, but I think that it's connected to the very largest question that you're asking of us today. So hopefully we'll get to that. Thank you. Those are my questions for now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Commissioner Campanella, questions for staff?
Thank you. Question for Mr. Buell, if I can. The when the City Council reviewed this, it was both vacation rentals and home sharing. They were looking to both. You mentioned in response to Commissioner Schwartz's question that vacation rentals did have an effect on housing and housing supply, given our shortage. Was the same feeling, did the same feeling exist by City Council in regard to home sharing, that was causing a problem with our housing stock?
Chair Thompson, Commissioner Campanella, I don't recall any specific distinction made by the City Council between a comment or distinction made between vacation rental and home sharing with regards to its potential impact on housing stock.
No distinction. Okay. And then there was on slide, let's see, 9, I believe, we were comparing the amount of listings. Is that slide number 9? Yeah. For staff, question for staff. You show the city of Santa Barbara had 1,000 plus online listings. Are those home sharing only, that number?
Sure. Chair Thompson and Commissioner Campanella. Since this issue first came up in June, I probably could have spent 110% of my time chasing all the different websites and seeing how things are listed and how they're not, and we purposely haven't done that. Okay. But Santa Barbara has held steady at 1,000 plus. We don't know if it's 2,000 or 3,000, but 1,000 plus rentals of either entire homes or rooms. Okay. Entire homes make up the much greater majority than the rooms, but we don't know at this point whether with the enforcement that's taking place over the next 2 or 3 years, how much of those will shift to rooms versus entire homes. So it's very fluid and it changes every day. You go this week and go next week and you'll see different listings. And
I could see the problem because I was trying to figure, how do you figure it out? Because listings go on, they go off. But in that, let's say if 1,000 were the number, 2,000 were the number for approximation. Within, if you can isolate the doing a count or a sample room for a vacation room, which you'd see on the websites. If you could isolate that, you would still have to break down what our question is today. How many of those online listings or available sites are there within the R1, R2, and R3 zones versus advertisements that are being done for home sharing within the zones that it would be continued to be allowed, right? So you'd have to try to isolate that number. So we don't know right now what the impact is, what it could be, where it would shift. We don't know the dynamics at this point.
Correct.
Question for our city attorney. If I look at the zoning ordinance on the R1, R2, R3, which are subjects for today's discussion, I was considering in my mind looking at making this decision based upon what the intent of those zones are, and it's pretty well consistent that it's prohibiting activities of a commercial nature in the R1, R2, R3 in order to maintain a residential flavor in neighborhood. And we've determined that the home sharing is a commercial venture because of the exchange of money, and it's on a short, less than 30 days, so it's considered commercial. So we'd have to be coming up with a reason why that should be modified in some way in the case of home sharing. The other aspect, which I also want to consider, is it continues on, all three of them, R1, R2, R3, and those which would tend to be inharmonious with or injurious to the preservation of a residential environment. So I'm thinking we want to keep that in mind as well. So if we start coming up with, if we do agree to allow it in some way or under some conditions, that as we decide how to or under what conditions, are we coming up with those conditions that would keep in mind that we're trying to keep a harmonious and non-injurious situation to the preservation of a residential environment? That's sort of my train of thought. And if you could, am I off base, or is that something we should be considering in our actions?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, the way I'd answer that statement or question is I would expect that any amendment to the zoning to allow for home sharing would distinguish home sharing from other types of commercial uses, so that there's a clear distinction that home sharing, if it's an allowed use, would be distinguished from other not allowed commercial uses, and that there would be some expression that home sharing is consistent with the intent of those residential zones. So I expect that if we go forward with this, there will be some amendment to those intent statements regarding those residential zones that finds home sharing to be harmonious with the intended purpose of the zones.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That finishes the questions from the commission for the staff. Next, we're going to open it up for public testimony. Every speaker, and we have quite a few that want to speak, will get 2 minutes. So I ask you to be concise and focused in your comments, because we want to let everyone have their chance to speak. So first up will be Michael Conaway, followed by Deborah Pentland.
Good afternoon, members of the Planning Commission. My name is Mike Conaway, and I've been living in a primary-owned single-family home for 28 years. I provided each of you with a package with my comments and some attachments beginning this week. And I think if your objective with vacation rentals, short-term home sharing ordinance is to increase housing stock, I feel there's no point in shutting down people like myself, whose home is their primary residence, that cannot be rented year-round, who have been outstanding neighbors and citizens, who have been paying by the rules and paying TOT taxes. I believe the presence of the owner or a designated property manager within the neighborhood of the home sharing residence provides sufficient local supervision during the rental period. I feel there's no reason to require a property owner to physically be present on the premises during the home sharing. In fact, restrictions creates an awkward, uncomfortable situation for any family gathering. If the purpose is to keep rentals available for year-round rentals, a limit of 60 days would sufficiently curb non-resident owners to rent year-round. I sent you an attachment with Mayor Schneider's remarks, I think, that support that premise. I attached an article showing how San Francisco brings in over $1 million a month in taxes for vacation rentals and has 6-person staff that issues permits and enforces proper behavior. Large fines are assessed for nuisance violations. Vacation rentals and home sharing are part of the shared economy that is vital for Santa Barbara to retain a healthy base of young professionals, from artists to nurses, that cannot afford to live here. The shared economy has grown substantially over the past 10 years. There are numerous other examples of this in existence in all zoning areas, including individuals that use their homes for tax preparation, notary public service, massage therapy, manufacturing of toys and crafts works, bicycle repair, and a home base and trucks for cleaning services. None of these, I believe, are permitted under current zoning. Banning home sharing drives it underground, leaves the city of Santa Barbara with only invasive police state-like resources, like having inspectors knocking on doors to see if home sharing is being properly operated, which I feel is an invasion of personal property rights.
Thank you very much. Deborah Pentland, followed by Dorothy Wallstein.
Good afternoon, Commission. Thank you for letting me present. I've been a 32-year resident of Santa Barbara County, and I've been a landlord for 30 years, housing many people who can't afford to live here. I support that there be host vacation rentals with non-owner occupied being present. And why I feel that, I've lived in the same neighborhood for 26 years. There's been monthly rentals and weekly rentals, and quite honestly, the weekly rentals were so quiet I didn't even know anybody was there. The monthly rentals, which were full of City College students, were very loud and rambunctious. So I feel that we really need to look at what is really happening. I personally have a family. I've rented in San Francisco, Seattle, Tahoe, upstate New York, Colorado, and those communities remained intact. We have a natural flow that monitors. Not everybody is going to want to do a vacation rental. There's a balance. And I think the new shared economy should be embraced. We do have a housing crisis. We should look at garages and everything and bring them up to code and create second units, rather than being more restrictive, we need to be open to the changes that are happening. I know people sleeping in cars to work at the MTD 4 days a week. This really isn't the issue of our affordable housing. This is a general economy issue, and I think there needs to be some balance, and we as a progressive city need to embrace it. Thank you.
Thank you. Dorothy Wallstein, followed by Tiffany Haller.
Hello, I'm a property owner, and I host home shares, and it's enabling me as a widow to stay in my home. I wouldn't be able to afford to live in my home if I couldn't continue to do that, and I believe that the majority of people who do home share hosting are in a similar position, that, you know, they need the extra income. It's a way of doing that. I have a very strict code of conduct that every one of my guests agrees to before I accept their rental, about noise, nuisance to neighbors, and so on. And I make it clear to them that if there's any violation whatsoever, they'll be asked to leave immediately. I've never had any problem. They're the nicest people in the world. And I should also say that I have a large family and 9 grandchildren, and when my family needs to come, I need my home. So I would not ever rent. I'm sorry, but I can't contribute to the housing stock, but I can look after myself as a widow in retirement by supplementing my income in this way, and hopefully that's a benefit to the community too. Okay.
Thank you. Tiffany Haller, followed by Todd Jacobs.
Good afternoon. My name is Tiffany Haller, and I am a real estate broker, and I'm also a property manager. I am actually talking about, I think there's a real fundamental problem with how it's being designated right now and how you're designating both vacation rentals and now home sharing. Anything less than 30 days, you're calling it a commercial use, and there's so many other things that come into play when you call it a commercial use. I don't know how an owner that lives in his property for a month, 2 months, 6 months out of the year and rents it for 29 days or 15 days it's now become a commercial use. It's still being rented as a residential property. It's not being rented as an office space or anything of the sort. While you're talking about home sharing, it might be a good idea with this new potential ordinance to clean up what your ordinance is with vacation rentals. It's definitely something that the city is having an issue with the vacation rentals. I know because I'm now 9 weeks in the process of this process right here and getting a property legally vacation rented with George. And it's a very disjointed process. It involves going through ABR. It involves going, the form changed last week. So I really think you guys need to really understand that the process needs a big overhaul. And it all boils down to is your ordinance is outdated and it needs to change and not be considered a commercial use.
Thank you very much. Todd Jacobs, followed by Brian Kinney.
Good afternoon. I'd like to go on record as opposing the home sharing ordinance. I think that it's worse than VRBO and that it exacerbates the noise, parking, and other problems associated with having too many people in a house. The profit and commissions go to agents and speculators at the cost of the neighbors that actually bought their homes to live in them and raise their families and not live next to a commercial enterprise. Case in point, next door to me, there's a house, E1 neighborhood. It's broken into 4 units. I've complained to the city over the year scores of times, as have all the people that owned my house before me. Currently, there's 2 families renting part of it. The owner lives in the converted garage, and then there's still the tool shed to rent, and it's all available on VRBO. Takes up every parking spot on the street, parties all the time. So that's the flip side of this, is how does it affect the neighbors? And I think this is going to be hard to enforce and easy to game. And I believe that the delegation of owners living in the house to kids or other agents really leaves you back at a VRBO again. I mean, if the owner's not in the house, come on. It's a backdoor way to have vacation rentals by owner. And I'm surprised that we're even having this hearing. Really, my takeaway at the end of the city council hearing on August 11th was most of the council members went with what the mayor wanted, which was to have staff look into this. But really, it was almost unanimous against VRBO, and this is just another version of the same. It's hard on our neighbors, it's hard on the neighborhoods, and it's really not fair to the people who just want to live in their house, go to work. My wife and I both work for the government, and it takes everything we make to live where we live, and we just want to raise our kids in a quiet place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Brian Kenny, followed by Dick Buford.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. The prior speaker pretty much said exactly what I was going to. I would like to see no homestay ordinance at all because it will be completely unenforceable and will just lead to a backdoor to vacation rentals. The people that are currently doing vacation rentals have demonstrated that they have a disregard for the current ordinance, and I'm sure that they'll take this new homestay ordinance as just a backdoor into using the properties as vacation rentals. Thank you.
Thank you. Dick Buford, followed by Greg Merrill.
Thank you, Commissioners. My wife and I and kids have lived in our neighborhood in Bel Air Knolls for 25 years. 2 years ago, a contractor got a permit for a single-family home, told his prospective neighbors that it was for a single-family home, and before he'd even received an occupancy permit, had them on Airbnb and was renting them out actively. The parking and the noise were oppressive. I'm one of those 8 people that complained, and with the assistance of the building department, got that to stop. But it's a very, very dangerous path to open up home sharing to everybody. It will literally turn our neighborhoods into like commercial zones where people come and go at all times of the night. The so-called host in our situation was a part-time host. Various people served as hosts while this was going on, and they were not always there when the behaviors that I'm objecting to occurred. I've had to go over there and knock loudly on the door to get it to stop. The other comment I have is regarding the housing situation. Housing Authority, Rob Pearson, has said that in the last several years, at the same time that these Airbnb and VRBO and like operations were starting, that the housing stock has fallen 1,400 units in Santa Barbara. The very people that can't get into these homes or into this new home across the street from me are left out in the street or unable to find sufficient housing for their families because of these kinds of commercial investment-driven operations. I don't deny that there's a benefit to the city, but there's the people who are promoting this are, I'm going to throw out a number, people can quibble, 10% of the population of homeowners in this town. The other 90%, just because they don't complain about their neighbors every week, doesn't mean they're not happy with it. And I've talked to many neighbors who don't like this situation, including a former planning commissioner that's not here today.
Okay, thank you very much. Greg Merrill, followed by James Finker. Mr. Merrill? Not here. Okay, James Finker, and I think it says Tobrana Finker would like to donate 2 minutes of her time to you.
Yes, thanks. Thank you very much. My wife is very kind. She's going to give me her 2 minutes.
Did she tell you what to say?
In fact, she did. Thanks very much for holding this meeting. I think the presentation was very well put together, by the way, and the questions were also, I think, getting to some of the important points. We have a vacation rental here in Santa Barbara, and we also, when we leave in the summertime, to go to other vacation rentals across America to bring our girls, we rent our home. So we have a really good experience with this. And I don't know, I mean, maybe by show of hands on this committee, I don't know if anyone's ever used a vacation rental. You've used it, yeah. If you haven't, they're fantastic. And I think if you look at some of the numbers here, we have 3 of the complaints here. If there are 8 complaints, they shouldn't be ignored. I mean, we need to have a system, not where we banish vacation rentals, but just where they're managed. Where there's a few bad apples, yeah, create some system where we can address those. But if you're talking about 1,000 units and only 8 complaints this year, even if that goes up to 80, it's still less than 1%. So by putting it in perspective of what we're doing here, I think is very important. The last point I would make is whether the owner should be at the home when there's a rental. And just in terms of the vacation rentals themselves, mostly we're renting to families. And it's be very unusual for a family to come in and rent a few rooms in someone's house. I mean, you're not going to come to Santa Barbara and have your kids stay down the hallway with some stranger. That's just not what vacation rental is all about. It's about having a house that's kind of like your house where you can enjoy the city. Anyway, thanks very much for listening to me. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha Ireland is next, followed by Sean O'Neill.
Hi, I'm Samantha Ireland. I'm the owner and operator of Vacation Rentals of Santa Barbara, and I do represent quite a few owners that both live in their homes and some that are not present. I'm here to say that we do want you to pursue home sharing. The business license and registration is important, and we should do that. I had the same question about the performance standards. I don't know about the planning permits. I know what Tiffany Holler said is very true, that what you have to go through now if you're located in an R4 in order to be approved as a vacation rental or home share is extremely cumbersome. And I think that in all of time, there's only been one that has been approved. So that needs to be looked at. If you're saying there is an area that it's allowed, but it's not possible to get the permit, there's a problem with that. I don't think it's necessary for the owner to be present for many of the reasons that were brought up by the previous speaker, but I do think it's important for there to be someone, management company, someone designated 24 hours within a specific time frame that can respond to that home and is present managing it. That should be noted with the city on the business license and permits and so forth. The city's already allowing renting in homes. I would love a definition on or an explanation on what the significant difference is on renting a room for 29 days versus 31 days. If someone could tell me how that impacts the neighborhood differently, I would love that. And then concerning the crisis on the housing, what percentage does vacation rentals affect in comparison to the extreme growth of City College and the lack of City College providing housing for that growth? And why is this small industry being addressed so significantly right now when that huge issue is not being addressed if we're talking about housing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sean O'Neill, followed by Steve Pearson.
Great. Good afternoon, Commissioners. I'm here today to urge support of home sharing. I think it is absolutely worth pursuing. And with the advent of technology, it's created an easy way of networking. What used to be perhaps pen and paper networking between coming into a city, coming into a home and sharing it now has come up with technology that makes it faster and quicker. And I recommend licensing and keeping this process in the light. It's already happening. It's already here. And the best way for the city to deal with it is to regulate it, license it, get it on the books, and keep it in the light so that we can see what's happening and provide fair regulation. You know, we've talked a little bit about the number of complaints that's happened. It's a very small amount. And I would challenge the city to address the complaints that have come from long-term residents, the college students, and other areas that aren't this short-term basis for sharing of a home or renting. I do believe that neighbor concerns can be mitigated. I think that owners of these homes care about their neighbors, and I think that's reflected in what they're doing. There's obviously an interest in themselves to be able to take care of themselves and be able to have revenue as well from this experience. I think there's good people that are coming into this city, and there's a reason why Santa Barbara is so popular. Is because we've created this as a tourism center, and this has impact to small businesses. When hotels are sold out, people are still coming, and that's something that we've created as a city, and it affects every person that's in this town when those people come in and spend. And the number of homes that was listed at 1,000, I'd question that a little bit as well, because a lot of those websites that are online have multiple people will cite them on multiple sites, and I think you should understand that number as well, that it's out there. So today I urge the Planning Commission to pursue home sharing, keep it uncomplicated, keep it out of the weeds, get people to register, know what you have, enforce those who break the rules and cause problems. There's a way to do that in the right way. And support businesses, and that's what's bringing these people in. It's a new day. My last thought for you is just, what if the government can keep pace with technology and innovation? You have that chance here today. Thank you.
Thank you. Steve Pearson, followed by Kathy Henry.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is Steve Pearson. We have a small cottage that we do rent on a short-term basis to help cover our taxes in this community. We've always paid our TOTs, to let you know. We've always played by the rules. We support a limited homestay type operation. We have suggested a letter to the Commission, perhaps limited to 2 persons per bedroom, not to exceed 4 persons per property. Highly limit the number of guest visitors, if any, that are allowed. Require typical owner occupancy that would remove a lot of the managerial problems and other problems that have happened. Require some off-street parking, additional off-street parking that will eliminate some of the parking problems that people have noted in the instance that I've heard. We would also request that you consider allowing cottages and accessory buildings, because a lot of places in the city do have those, and they can be very properly used to enhance the visitor experience here. We have no particular position on business licenses versus planning permits. We simply request that if it's a permitted process, please make it something that's workable, because there can be problems trying to get permits sometimes. And I think if we have a very limited homestay, most of the issues that have been noted in the before the council and stuff will simply not exist. It will be very small operations, very, very negligible impact, if any, on the neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Kathy? Is it Henry? Okay, Susan Claire Reed, followed by Bradley Bennett.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Claire Reed. I married a hometown boy in 1964, and I've been here ever since. Puts me about 41-year resident. I run a home share in my house a few blocks from here. I started July 1st last year. I certainly hope you can support the kind of homestay that I do. I figured out on the way over here in my head that roughly 18% of my visitors, my guests, have been from foreign countries. And many of them, their English is very hard for me to understand in a close, face-to-face, supportive atmosphere. They love coming to me to sort of guide them, protect them, tell them where to go, draw pictures where to go. Either my housemate or I are always in residence when we have guests. I may run out to the market or whatnot, but it's my primary residence, and I sleep there. You know, what else am I going to do? The question about the 1,000, I've been wondering about that too. I'm one of the less than 350 who has continuously had a business license and paid my TOT. Because of that, I am blessed to keep running my business until the end of the enforcement effort. So they'll take my money to enforce the other guys who didn't pay. It is a wonderful thing to do a home share. You get interesting people. You get to talk to them. You get to find out about them. I feel I'm a good ambassador for Santa Barbara. I'm friendly and I'm helpful to them. Please consider allowing home shares. With a host, I have no problem with that. Reasonable permits, plannings, performance, whatever, that's fine. I think it's a good thing for Santa Barbara. I think it enhances the availability of Santa Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you. Bradley Bennett, followed by Theo Cracky.
Hi, Commissioners. Thank you for giving us time to speak to this issue. I am here to speak in favor of home sharing. I am a 46-year resident of Santa Barbara. Home sharing has allowed me to provide additional housing for those visiting Santa Barbara while giving me the funds necessary to continue to afford owning my home while I start my individual small startup business, which has created 10 jobs in this community. In my 2 years of being a host in my home share, my experience has been very different than the gentleman who spoke against it earlier, and I'm not just coloring a picture that's untrue to just support my cause up here. I mean, I truly have not had a single experience where I've had a neighbor that has been displeased or concerned with what has gone on in my house. I'm there to manage it and watch it. My guests come typically in 1 or 2 cars, their families, or their 2 couples that are reuniting after having gone to college here. They're providing money, they're spending in the community, they respect the neighbors, they respect my rules. I am present. I meet every guest that comes in. I spend most nights in the house, but as far as what kind of owner occupancy, I mean, I certainly am gone during the days when I work. I have a girlfriend, and we spend a lot of time at her house, but I spend most of the time in my house. What would be the definition in there? Something that's 100%, obviously would be restrictive to anyone even leaving town for the weekend. But I do understand the need to be there and be present, and I think my involvement with the house and vetting the guests that stay here has been a big contributor to the great guests that I've had. And I think that that it's a case example that it can be well managed and for a very good result. And obviously, we can create policies that will help vet out and take care of enforcing against people that are not well managing their properties well. There was a question, will a ban result in driving things underground? I think that's quite possible, and I think case studies have shown that. Cities that have had short-term vacation rental policies have overturned them, and I think it's a risk here. I think it's a risk with our previous decision the council's previous decision to overturn short-term rentals in general. So I do think that is a concern. I think fair regulation in that case then is the best solution to addressing any of these situations.
Thank you very much. Theo Cracky, followed by Brian Smith.
Hi, Chris Bender has donated his 2 minutes to me. My name is Theo Cracky. I'm a 34-year resident of Santa Barbara, and I wanted to say that I'm here in favor of allowing home sharing rentals in Santa Barbara. There's a couple of reasons we're here. I wanted just to readdress with everybody, which is there's 2 reasons the City Council decided to begin this process and actually prohibit them overall, which was or enforce the zoning, which then prohibits them, is that there is a shortage of affordable housing, and short-term rentals affect that. But no one to this date still has cited any formal report or study that supports that fact. It's anecdotal. There's nothing that proves that. The reason we have a shortage for affordable housing, number one, is that Santa Barbara have been here since 1981. There's always been that shortage. City College has exploded. There's no providing of housing there. The foreign language schools have exploded. And even our growth of our high tech, I was just reading about Sonos, who has 500 employees here in town now, too. So there's lots of major reasons affecting the housing supply, and short-term vacation rentals is a very small part of that. The other premise that brought us here today was that this was negatively affecting the character of residential neighborhoods. And I think I do totally emphasize with the neighbors that stood up and complained about poorly managed rentals that have that have a lack of respect for them. Was happy to hear that the one did complain and he was shut down. That's exactly the system that needs to be put in place. But the majority of owners are not like that. The majority of owners respect their neighbors, want to have great relationships with them, and want to beautify the neighborhood and improve it for them and for themselves and for their neighbors. The other thing they talk about is that this neighborhood characters can really be degraded by short-term rentals. That's if you allow every single home in a neighborhood to be a short-term rental. However, the city of Nashville and the city of Austin both decided to say, let's make no more than 5% of our houses short-term rentals. And therefore, they limit by neighborhood the amount of permits that they allow for short-term rentals. And that can be further drilled down to, say, every 20 houses or something like that, so they're not concentrated. So there's some good solutions that can preserve neighborhood compatibility, yet still allow this very valuable activity for a lot of people. Finally, I think there does need to be a new definition of commercial use, because I truly believe that a 30-night rental is no different than a 29-night rental. They're all rentals. A landlord who does 30-night rentals, why is that not considered a commercial enterprise? It's just a rental. The length of stay is not correlate commercial. There's no goods or services being traded. Finally, my last points are just, again, I'm in favor of allowing home sharing. If you do drill down into the details, I think it's important to not require the owner to be there. And I also think I've heard some discussion about it being a minimum number of nights and stuff like that, and I don't think that's a correlation that should be enforced also. Thank you.
Thank you. Brian Smith, followed by Jack Usaferi.
Good afternoon. I am a 40-year resident of Santa Barbara. I live in my primary residence, and I also hold a license for a vacation rental business in my house, and I pay TOT taxes to the city. When I have guests in my house, I either go to friends' houses or family or guest house. I provide all my guests with a well-thought-out, strict set of rules and regulations to help them fully enjoy living there for a short time and help them live like a local and act like a member of Chamber of Commerce and direct people where to go and how to do it. I make an explicit goal not to disturb any of my neighbors or people around me. I have a 91-year-old neighbor who's lived there for 61 years, and the last thing I want to do is upset her. And I think that most people who own houses really do vacation rentals or home sharing, they don't want to disturb their neighbors. And so there is a distinction between the dreaded person who supposedly lives in New Jersey and has a home rental, vacation rental, they bought it on an income model, or an owner-occupant who actually does rent their house. I spoke to a Goleta city councilman earlier this year, and Goleta had a problem with vacation rentals. And we had a good conversation. He was very open about talking about some of the problems that they'd had. They instituted their vacation rental ordinance, and since that time, staff says they've had 0 complaints. What I heard from the commission members were concerns about regulation, enforcement, and monitoring. And regulation, enforcement, and monitoring of home sharing is going to be more difficult than vacation rentals that you can track online. I think it's unfortunate, actually, that this issue did not come to the Planning Commission before all the hearings that were held. And I think Commissioner Schwartz mentioned that. I think there's discussion that has not been completed or even directed towards finding what the facts are. What are the economic benefits? You know, I think the staff report said there were I believe it was 40 complaints in 10 years. That hardly seems like an emergency. Currently, there's 350 out of 1,000 or whatever the number rentals that are licensed to pay and have a vacation rental. For those people, $1.2 million was collected last year. Are there any facts and figures about what kind of difficulty the city has had in collecting those funds? Do those people have complaints against them? Do they come and pay their taxes on time? Are there enforcement problems there?
Could you start wrapping it up, please?
Yes, sir. So in conclusion, I would like to urge the Planning Commission to closely study home sharing and vacation rentals and help the city be a leader in setting effective policies that will benefit the city and the community for years to come.
Thank you very much. Jack Usaferi, followed by David Bolton.
Thank you, Commissioner Thompson and Planning Commissioners. My name is Jack Ucciferri. I'm the owner-operator of Our Town Property Management, which serves Santa Barbara residents who are traveling and while they are leaving their primary home unoccupied, engage in the activity of unhosted home shares. So what they're doing is taking zero housing off the stock of the market and reaping the benefits of earning some additional passive income while they're gone. By using me as a manager, they are mitigating any sort of neighborhood concerns. I'm available 24 hours a day to address any concerns that should come up. I would like to say that the owners that I represent are actually quite flabbergasted when I explain to them that the Planning Commission is even considering revoking this perceived right. It is, granted, it's not a right, but most people actually just understand their home to be their greatest asset. In fact, a home is often a liability, but this activity allows people to turn their home into an asset rather briefly while assisting the homeowner and the city in collection of transient occupancy tax. The final point I'd just like to make is that there are a number of enforcement tools which are available. I've addressed those in the submitted comments I've given you. And one final thing is, this also seems to be somewhat of a generational difference. I'm a 36-year-old young professional in this town. Most of my peers are also quite confused that this is such a big issue in the community. I do a pretty good job, I think, explaining what the issues at play are, but the so-called sharing economy, which some of us have problems with, is a sort of it's a cultural difference. And it is, in fact, something that will be coming down the pike, and I hope that our community can address this in an open and progressive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. David Bolton, followed by Barbara Bonatis. Excuse me.
Chairman and Commissioners, thank you so much. My name is David Bolton. I'm a vacation rental owner here in Santa Barbara. I've been doing it for the last couple years, and I really think vacation rentals are good. My day job is to preserve the California missions, and I only bring it up for one thing. About 3 weeks ago, Junipero Serra was made a saint by the Pope, and everybody attacked him for everything that was wrong with Spanish colonialism in the Americas. And I only bring that up because it seems today so many people are using vacation rentals to blame for everything wrong with Santa Barbara. We hear about the housing stock and the price of housing. I remember maybe 10 years ago at the height, prices in Santa Barbara were higher than they are today, and there were no vacation rentals then. So to blame vacation rentals for all of our problems is not fair. There's more homes in my neighborhood that are single-family homes that put more cars on the street than my vacation rentals. I have a house across. 7 people are renting rooms there. They're all in their 30s, have great jobs. Every one of them park on the street. There's a home around the corner from me. 12 people are living in a 2-bedroom home. They choose to do it. They all have great jobs. They have huge cars. I can just imagine what they spend on gas. They choose to live together. Vacation rentals are not bad. We need them in this city. We do not have enough hotel stock to go around. There are so many weekends when our hotels are sold out. Our vacation rentals are sold out. These people come to town. They eat at our restaurants downtown. A lot of people in Montecito are not coming to State Street to our restaurants. People in Goleta, with all the options there, are not coming into town. Our restaurants and other places in this town need our vacation rental people to be there to spend money. One other thing I would like to mention. The way vacation rentals go is in trends. In the summer, we're full. That's just the way Santa Barbara is. But if you look at right now, it just started a few weeks ago. Monday to Thursday, most vacation rentals have nobody there. They come on weekends. And it's going to be that way until probably January or February when people come for a month to get out of the colder climates. So right now, if I were to rent out my units to people that were renting long-term, I could have as many as 14 cars parked on the street because that's how many bedrooms are on my property. Right now, there are 0, Monday through Thursday. There are good things about vacation rentals, and all the naysayers are bringing up the bad, and they are not the reason for all of our problems in this town. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. Barbara Monatics. Hope I got it pronounced right this time. Followed by Jenna Berg.
Dale. Good afternoon, distinguished members of the Planning Commission. I have been a member of Santa Barbara for over 40 years. My grown children and their families are also living and working in this community. We, along with other permanent residents, feel that the communal life of the city is being gradually destroyed by the penchant for tourist dollars. Now this onslaught of short-term renters changes the entire character of a residential neighborhood. And when I say renters, I mean the key thing is short-term. The difference is not 29 versus 30 days. The difference is 1 night, 2 nights, 1 week versus 30 days. I lived across the street from a vacation rental. The comings and goings of travelers at all hours of the day or night is the hallmark of a motel environment. It is to be expected in commercial zones. But once you turn a private residence into a commercial enterprise, it is no longer an area of family-oriented, permanent people who are connected to one another and who deeply care about the future of this city and its environment. The failure of enforcing the wise, very wise zoning laws that were already in place has already shown, it seems to me, shows a disregard for the people who expect their homes to be a retreat from the hustle and bustle of the city proper. I urge you to reinstate and enforce the original zoning laws, which disallow commercial business in residential neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you. Jenna Berg, followed by Kip Young.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for your time and devoting your entire afternoon to this amazingly interesting topic. I am in favor of home sharing and short-term rentals. Tourism is a very clean industry. We are all trying to find a way to make a living. There are many industries that can be brought into this town. Tech is also a pretty clean industry. Tourism is a very clean industry. If I had to pick an industry, I would choose tourism over oil. So one thing I think we should look at is we are a growing economy. There is no shutting the doors on tourism. My neighbor, who lives next to a short-term rental and on the other side of me, because I actually own the short-term rental next to her, we have created a family orientation in our rather disparate little neighborhood in downtown Santa Barbara, where there are a lot of long-term renters who are not very respectful of the neighbors, who drink at all hours, who leave beer bottles on the streets, and who park everywhere. Dario Pino owns the property next to that particular one I'm talking about, and there are lots and lots of people there. So it's a very mixed neighborhood. I had the very good fortune of purchasing the property next to mine. Eleanor Milne, 99 years old, died in that property. She was grandmother to my children. Her family came to me and said, "Can you buy this house and preserve it for the neighborhood?" She still lives on, and this house lives on in our neighborhood as a core unifier of the neighborhood. And the woman next to her is thrilled that we don't have long-term renters there. The other thing I want to mention about the home sharing and the short-term rentals is there is a democratization of the tourist dollar. When you start talking about letting individual citizens of Santa Barbara capture some of that income. I don't know where the money that goes to the hotels ends up, but when you let the owners of properties or even renters who need affordable housing and maybe can rent a part of their property to help pay their rent, think of that, affordable housing for renters. They could home share, why not? That money that comes to us as citizens of this town who live here, who spend our dollars downtown, can help to support the very favored minimum wage increase. How are we going to support minimum wage in this town? We want to increase it? You've got to figure out how to do it. You can't just, from the top down, enforce a $15 minimum wage. Last weekend, every hotel was full in town. I met 3 or 4 couples on the streets who were all staying at short-term rentals and thrilled to be here. Absolutely thrilled to be here.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your time.
Kip Young, followed by Jane Fehrenbacher.
Hi, I don't own a vacation rental. I'm a resident, and I'm taking a perspective more from the efficiency of government and also from the standpoint of taxes. Tourism runs this town. I see no point in throwing good tax money out the window and that tax base in order to spend tax money to enforce something that's a relative non-issue. I've heard more and spent more time listening to complaints about 8 events that happened over the course of a year than actually what was probably spent on managing those complaints. So I would say if we're providing services for tourists, I don't like to pay my tax dollars to provide those services to have the government then throw those tax dollars that could have supported those services out the window. By rough calculations, if we're collecting 1.2 or 1.5 million in taxes, that represents about 15 million into the pockets of citizens here, some additional tax revenue into sales taxes into the community for what they spend here, and all of those taxes could be going to provide services. I would put a plug in for trying to minimize the enforcement. What a nightmare you guys have trying to figure this out. If you can come up with simple solutions, less invasive solutions, things that don't involve figuring out how many rooms somebody has and parking. I know a lot of people that have vacation rentals. When the people come in, there's less cars than the other people that are there, that live there long-term or the long-term rentals. I have neighbors that make a lot of noise. They're not vacation renters. I don't know how that compares relatively. But I would say let's collect our taxes, come up with a simple solution for enforcement-based fines, which are easy to track. You've got a validated complaint. Pass that on in terms of a fine to the person that's doing it. They get enough fines, you yank their license. And those in turns can be passed on to the people that are renting. They come in, they put a $1,000 deposit down for a fine. They don't have a complaint. They know they're getting their $1,000 back. If they don't make noise, everybody's motivated to be on the same page. So try a simple solution. Allow for people in the city to be able to afford their housing. I heard a number of cases throughout these hearings where people have saved their home and live here longer term because they were able to be less fragile, more anti-fragile against changes in the economy and be able to stay here and survive and continue with this tax base. I see increase in housing stock by being able to provide unused rooms into used rooms in the area, and I see no decrease in housing stock as a result of this. So please don't create issues that force people to go underground and to throw tax dollars out and spend tax dollars uselessly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jane Fehrenbacher.
Good afternoon. Thank you for listening. I'm here to speak for myself and for my daughter, who did send a letter in. I have lived in Santa Barbara. I think I might get the prize for speakers, 48 years. I've been a homeowner in Santa Barbara. And during that time, I have had short-term rentals, but most of mine have been foreign students. And I, of course, lived at the house. But more recently, I moved to a smaller home, and I have had, through family friends, I don't go, what are the agencies called, VRBO or those? I don't do that, but maybe twice a year, once a year. A friend of a friend and somebody will come back 2 years later and say, can we come again in August? All right. So there's absolutely no issues. And I think for those issues, those homes where trouble is caused, as other speakers have said, something can be done about that. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's too good to spoil. I really believe that. And I wanted to say one thing about my daughter. Nobody's really kind of brought this up. Did I say I have 8 children? Anyway, one of my daughters, 4 of them have homes in Santa Barbara. And one of them, I'll read just this paragraph. As a Santa Barbara homeowner, I'm in support of modifying the new city regulations regarding home sharing. The best way to explain why is to tell my situation, because there are many hosts in my same situation. I grew up in Santa Barbara. Most of my family lives here. Because my husband has to work in another state, however, I can't make it our full-time home. So they're fortunate enough to have a small home here in town where we spend half the year with family and old friends. At least 1 or 2 weeks a month she comes out, but in the meantime, they can use their home. She said, sometimes we used to leave it empty between visits, but things kept happening, random pipe leakages in the yard or house, et cetera, et cetera. So we tried doing long-term rentals, but then we were unable to come and use our own home. So that's another point of view. And one last story that she mentions. A family who came to stay called me 2 days early, asking if they could check in 1 day sooner. The hotel downtown they were in had so many students making noise late into the night they couldn't sleep. The majority of people who want to rent a house in Santa Barbara want a quiet stay, not a frat party. It is simple to choose who comes to my house. A hotel owner has a lot less control.
Thank you very much. Are there any other speakers that didn't submit a speaker slip? And did Kathy Henry or Greg Merrill come back? Okay, we'll close the public testimony. Staff, any final comments before the commission discusses the item? None? I'll mention to everybody that the recording of this meeting will be on the city's website this evening if anybody wants to review it again. So back to the commission for comments and feedback to the staff on the 3 issues they'd like feedback on. More questions, okay. Commissioner Schwartz, more questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On this topic of less than 30 days being the period in question, could staff or the city attorney's office comment on, if not how that came about, is that germane today? Is there some set of considerations we should look at as to why this number or less than that number is still applicable or is germane to our consideration?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Schwartz, I can start this if Mr. Vincent wants to finish. I'm not sure, but it comes directly from the definition of hotel in the zoning ordinance. It explicitly says for stays less than 30 days. So that's why that exact
trigger
number is used.
If we or the council wanted to contemplate a different period of time and such an ordinance, we would really need to revisit a number of other ordinance changes. That's what I'm getting from you,
That's
Ms.
correct.
Brooke. Okay, that was one question I had. The other is about the volume that we're talking about, the universe of potential home shares. And I was hearing Councilmember Hart comment, and I wanted to see if this is correct, that maybe this is just on short-term vacation rentals. 2/3 of the rentals are not only not following the city ordinance, but not paying TOT and the business license fee. So if 1,000 is just the totality of what we know, or is that the totality paying TOT and business license? And are we looking at, two-thirds of that on top of the 1,000 in terms of really looking at the universe and the potential impacts it might have for us to consider such an ordinance?
Commissioner Schwartz, to answer that question, we have just a rough idea of 1,000 or over 1,000 of these units available on listings. We know that there are somewhere around 300, I don't have the exact number, that are paying or have paid TOT.
So maybe a third, roughly. Would you say a third? Sounds like. Okay, then my next question is to zoning. And I think it was either Mr. Buell or Ms. Limon forwarded to me some pertinent zoning language. I'm not clear, if we contemplate this, I'm not clear in the total, all of the zones that will be applicable, because it's not just single family. For example, let me go to a couple of examples. So this is page 4 of 27 of what was sent to me. This is the RO restricted office zone, unless I'm not understanding this, which includes any use permitted in the R3, except as otherwise, provided in a subsection. So I don't know if, like, the fine print, we need to go through all the fine print to determine if a number of other zones that don't appear to be our R1, R2, R3 would actually allow then home shares. So that's one. Let me just keep going. I'll give you the total number that I've identified, and you can tell me. So then we have planned unit development zones. And it says here single family and or two family dwellings, multiple family. So that seems to be another. Then we have SP5 zones, which says right here, number 1, land use, single residential units are allowed. So that's the SP5 zone. And you can see,
Mr. Chair.
Veronica Meadows specific plan also includes. Yes, please.
Commissioner
Maybe the city attorney can explain it under pyramid zoning how that works.
Correct.
Well, I understand pyramid zoning, but go ahead.
Well, the beginning of the answer is our pyramid zoning, but the more specific answer is, as the language that you read,
yes,
as otherwise excluded within this zone. In other words, the pyramid exists. We can make exceptions so that if the pyramid zoning is allowing for long-term residential uses, we could make an exception for any particular zone that is by reference looking back to the R3. The point is, if the commission wishes to entertain an idea of home sharing, you can pick and choose which zones that would occur.
Okay. I had a question for staff. I'm not sure you had time to answer it for me. Here again, I looked at the HC Harbor commercial zone, and we know that there are liveaboards down at the harbor, but I didn't see any allowance in this zone for current residential use. Am I missing something? And here again, I'm thinking, gosh, if we open this up to home shares, and if the council and staff have to contemplate every single zone in which home shares could possibly be allowed, it would be additional zones beyond the R1, 2, and 3, according to how we have language written today. So eyes wide open, which is why I'm asking this question and some of the others.
Sure, Mr. Chair, Commissioner Schwartz. Certainly when we get to the point where we begin to draft an ordinance, if we get there, we would want to consider in which zones this might be allowed. So I just caution the commission in trying to frame your support or lack of support too much on what we currently have on the books, because what you would be asked to do months down the road would be to draft the ordinance that would allow this. So just, again, trying to keep it at a conceptual level if we can today. Thank you.
Okay. I'll just comment that, to me, the part of the concept is to try to envision what such an ordinance and a significant, how did Half put it? Staff said transient use in a residential zone is a significant policy change. So I'm trying to envision what a significant policy change would look like, would include, and where in our city. And I think that's a very important purview of the Planning Commission in terms of our land use planning responsibilities. Thanks you. Those are my questions for now.
Thank you, Commissioner Peugeot. Questions?
Thank you. I have just one follow-up question on staff's response to Commissioner Schwartz's question about the 30 versus the 29 days. And then I have another question that came up from one of the commenters that I would also like to ask. So on the cutoff between 30 days and 29 days, my understanding, besides the definition of hotel, and I believe it's under even perhaps a separate code section, I'm not sure, it might not even be zoning, is that under 30 days you can collect TOT taxes. I mean, that's the real key, right? Because for those shorter terms under 30 days, that's where you get the TOT, and if it's over 40 days, then you don't. It's like any other renting to a roommate kind of situation. I believe that's correct. Is that? Okay, I wanted to clarify that. And then one of the speakers brought a question to my mind, and that is about, it was a comment about the permitting requirements in R4 and what it takes to do something like short-term rentals or VRBO or any of the various other 89 companies out there in an R4. And there was an indication that it was a very onerous, complicated process. And I thought I would just ask, what would that process be in R4?
Mr. Chair and Commissioner Peugeot, I believe are you asking what is our current process today to try to permit a vacation rental in an R4 zone?
Correct.
Or are you asking
That's
me to
correct.
think ahead about home sharing? Okay, so currently today it is a challenging process, and we did admit that to City Council that the current rules we have on the books were not made or written to accommodate vacation rentals. We have hotel conversion ordinance within the zoning ordinance. I don't believe it's ever been used, so we have staff that are unfamiliar with it. That applies to somebody trying to convert more than one unit on a lot. So if you're talking about just, let's say for simplicity's sake, we're converting one unit, there are quite a number of rules that come into play. We've not been asked to do that until recently, so we are learning along with applicants. I'll admit that, but we have, for example, because it's considered a non-residential use, there needs to be an allotment of non-residential growth management square footage, which is why one of the speakers referenced that ABR review was required, because it tripped the threshold for a development plan. If there are external changes, then there would be design review. There are potentially building code upgrades. It's really, each case is very different. That's why it is difficult to try to encompass it in just one handout or one guide for people. We are learning, though, and we are hoping to make that a little bit less painful, but admittedly, it is challenging, and we're just trying to go down this road for the first time in the last few weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was really helpful. And then just one final question, because it most likely will come up in my comments later. On properties that have the configuration and the size requirements for a guest house in residential zones, talking about our current topic of basically R1, 2, and 3. Maybe it's only R1, actually. Isn't there a limitation on the number of days someone can actually have someone stay in that guest house, or can someone stay in that guest house all year?
Commissioner Peugeot, I am not aware of limits on the number of days someone can stay. Just, again, the same definition for hotel would apply, that someone could not stay for less than 30 days if money's exchanged.
But you can't rent a guest house currently, correct?
If it's a legal guest house, you could rent it to a long-term
tenant. Oh, I see.
Correct.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Campanella, you have further questions?
Questions, if I can. Just to be clear in my mind, today we're talking about home sharing units, home sharing rental. The vacation rentals, even though there's a process to get approval, I'm asking the question, even though there's a process to get approval, they are currently allowed in R4 and all of the commercial zones, is that correct?
Just for extreme clarity, most commercial zones. There are some very unique commercial zones where they're not allowed.
Okay.
But we've been trying to be general when we refer to that. Okay.
And then the City Council, the direction right now, the feeling of the City Council is that's going to stay as currently is allowed. The main question we have before us is in the R1, R2, R3 zones that do not allow vacation rentals. Do we feel that home sharing is appropriate? And later, is that correct, those three?
Commissioner Campanella, we haven't explicitly said that you should consider only for those zones. It's really just on a concept basis. You might consider home sharing in only the zones that vacation rentals are allowed, but maybe there's a less arduous process for them. So really, it's open for you to guide us and counsel in that way.
Okay, thank you. Second question, whatever is determined, I'm presuming that CC&Rs that are incorporated either within a plan unit development or an attached product still would prevail relative to allowing or not allowing either vacation rentals or home sharing, they would still take precedent?
Mr. Chair, members of the Commission, in general, CC&Rs are not enforced by the city. That would be a matter between the homeowners association and the individual owners within that homeowners association.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. To clarify, if we did allow in certain zones home sharing, and it's not allowed in the CC&Rs of a complex that may be in that zone, they would still have a right to prohibit it, even though by zoning we allowed it.
That would be true, yes.
Okay, thank you. Sorry I misspoke on that. And last question, on the city of San Luis Obispo and Santa Monica that we're doing comparisons to, there are no, in both cases, there's no vacation rentals allowed at all. Right? And then the homestay and home sharing, as they're defined rentals, are they allowed in all zones or only specific zones?
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Campanella, correct to your first question, vacation rentals are prohibited citywide in Santa Monica and San Luis Obispo, and I believe the home share and homestay are allowed anywhere that residential uses are allowed. They're not geographically confined.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Lodge, question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. My question, too, that you're asking for a yes or no answer to asks if planning permits and performance standards or business license and registration. Could you just tell me a little more about what the difference would be between the two? Would it be possible to have performance standards with a more simple business license procedure, or I would like a little expansion on that. Thank you.
Chair Thompson and Commissioner Lodge, clearly this isn't as clear as we would like it to be, because cities have done either 2A or 2B or a blend of both of them. And so in some cases, if it's a business license and registration, there are application requirements that make you fill out affidavits that it's your primary residence and proof, and affidavits that you'll only rent a certain number of times a year, things such as that. The performance standard permits are more, you're issued a permit and you must comply by these standards or you're subject to enforcement. So it's sort of whether it's at the application intake part or as a operational condition that the city would be responsible for enforcing. Don't know if that clarifies.
Okay, time for the Commission to start giving some feedback to the staff, particularly pay attention to the 3 questions that they asked that are up on the screen right now. Who'd like to start it off? Commissioner Peugeot.
Okay, I'll take a stab at this. In obviously following all the discussions that have taken place at every level on this topic over the last several months, particularly, and in today's hearing as well, this is what I see, that here are the issues, basically the problems we're trying to grapple with. One is the change in the residential character as being in any one house, that house being used primarily for residential uses, and the neighborhood being basically a residential family neighborhoods, which is a really true, valid concern. The second is in the environment we have in Santa Barbara with the cost of housing. We have concerns with availability of housing stock, and I would add, I believe that to be particularly in the case where vacation rentals occupy 100% of the use of the property, and there is no basic family or owner relationship with the neighborhood or residency. And also the need to allow people to stay in their houses who have managed to find housing in a difficult, expensive community. And we've heard some of those stories today, and there was one particular speaker who mentioned that she is widowed, and it allows her to bring in the additional income she needs, but still allows her family to come in and stay with her when needed as well, which is, different than having a long-term roommate situation. And I think that's also a very valid issue. We also heard about basically nuisances, noise, concerns that are difficult to address if there isn't a responsible person to contact. All valid. I might also add parties and lighting and that kind of thing too would fall in that category. Here are my comments about those things in the relationship to our concept review, particularly in this case, I'm addressing in this one items 1 and 3. Is the concept of home sharing worth pursuing, and should the host be present in the home? Those are 2 items that are connected for me. I just start to say that there's a very basic premise in land use planning and zoning, and that has to do with the difference between a primary use and an ancillary use. So when we designate our zones and we designated uses, we look in concept and in principle to what we want that primary use to be. But in each of those zones, there are a plethora of ancillary small uses that are just develop along the way as being kind of a part of the whole ball of wax of what comes with that particular use. For example, in residential zones, it's primarily residential, but we do allow home occupations. We allow a certain number of garage sales. There's, from time to time, under a conditional use permit, an additional allowable use with a higher level process that can take place given the right circumstances, even in a residential zone. We're even looking now, I think, in our zoning ordinance of some locations where we could have small garden or corner markets in or on the edge of a residential zone. And those are all uses that, even though the primary use is residential, we know come along with just family life and being part of a community, and they don't overwhelm the main use. And that's an important premise and an important one for me in my view of this concept ordinance. And outside of what we might find in a zoning ordinance, there are also, in addition to what we've been talking about today in terms of vacation rentals and potentially homestays, there are other kinds of arrangements that take place in homes that cause perhaps a few days a year the house maybe not being occupied by an owner. Like, for example, some people do home exchanges where the owner exchanges a house in another community for that person's stay in their home, which might be in Santa Barbara. When people go on vacation, sometimes they hire dog sitters to come stay in their house, or they have other people come and stay in their house just so it's not empty while they're on vacation. Those things are all understood to be within the bounds of what the residential use is. And I'm going into this detail because, to me, there's a tremendous difference between basically what I would think of as an empty house that gets rented out most of the time for a vacation rental, and a house that is primarily owner-occupied or tenant-occupied, and for a couple of weeks a year, maybe it's 3 weeks, I don't know what the number is, but for a short period of time while they're on vacation, they're entrusting their home, either for pay or without pay, to someone that's going to come in and stay there using their furniture, their kitchen supplies, whether they're hosted on premise or not. To me, the key issue is that it's short-term and ancillary to the primary use, and that 2, there's enough in terms of controls, contact information, performance measures, so that there's someone always available, as one gentleman added, 24/7 to answer questions and be available if there's any concerns or problems that arise. I also think that in terms of enforcement, to have performance standards is very, very important in any of these circumstances. So I think you can probably see where I'm going with this. I hope at this point my comment would be that home sharing and short-term, very short-term, some maximum number of days per year. I don't know if that's a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, that would be something to be decided in the future. But something ancillary, even if the host isn't present, to me is acceptable. It's acceptable as long as it comes with a list of performance measure requirements that provide those safeguards that would assure us that those nuisance items would not occur. So that's in concept where I am with this, and whether it's a planning permit or a business license and registration, my guess would be it depends on the list of performance standards that we produce. Some will lend themselves to one type of a permit or another, or maybe it ends up being both in some cases. There's a few on the list that staff provided in their staff report, and there's also a few possible performance standards that are listed in, open stays? One of the gentlemen that provided a long list of basically how the, I think it's called open stays, I'm not sure. But also in one of the letters, we got a long list there too. There's several good ideas in there, some that I think are very, very much workable in terms of performance standards. And I think that that's the direction that I would like to see this ordinance take.
Commissioner Jordan, I think you were next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I have no doubt that of everybody out here who spoke today in favor of vacation rentals or home sharing would be a welcome neighbor of mine. I might not be your welcome neighbor, as a matter of fact. In 27 years in our house, we've gone from 0 to 4 kids. We have dogs. We have chickens. We've had screaming mobs of Girl Scouts in the backyard. We've bounced balls and wiffle balls off of neighbors' fences and walls. And so that I might not be your favorite share of or picture of a neighbor. I think what the difference to me is that as I describe what my 27 years has been in my neighborhood, those are characteristics or components of a neighborhood and the dynamics in it that are agreed to over a period of time. They're blended in over that period of time. They're negotiated with your neighbors, they're rejected, they're accepted, they're modified, and it becomes part of the neighborhood dynamic. What we're talking about today in home sharing could be, and vacation rentals I don't think could be at all, but the difference between the two is that people are coming and going and bringing those same type of consequences over a much more focused time. It's not a 30-day period, just as the one speaker said. It's a 2-night, 3-night, or 1-week period followed by another period with a different set of constraints or consequences. So my answer to the first question is no, for those reasons. And if this was to migrate to the second question, get that far, because there were more yeses than nos, I agree that the devil are in the details of how you're going to measure what's what constitutes a successful set of measurements versus not. I'm reluctant, or I'm apprehensive that this goes the way of some. If you got to the second part and you developed some criteria there, that it goes the way of a CUP, where we don't anticipate things just because it's brand new. And now we've got an issue where we allowed somebody to do something under a certain set of guidelines. They're vested, so to speak, but we didn't anticipate a situation that might occur, and now we can't take that away from them, even though there's an obvious negative consequence. So, the devil are in the details. I say no to the first question because I don't think the second question can be handled. I don't think you can enforce this situation. The caveat to that, I think, is in my perfect world, is, people have mentioned here we're going to drive it underground. It's already underground. You're not asked. We're not changing anything today. The situation on the street right now is that it is not an acceptable use in a single-family neighborhood. So it is already underground. And in my perfect world, I think it should continue underground with good quality management, with good relations between the neighbors. And if it rises to the level of complaints, it gets dealt with. I'm not interested in putting any of you out of business. I'd like to see you stay in business, be compatible with your neighbors, be compatible with your neighborhoods, despite the fact that you don't have an ordinance that allows you to do so. And I think that puts the burden on the operations, you sitting out there in the seats, to do a good job and have those relationships with your neighbors and not change the character of the neighborhood. If we got to number 3, if we possibly got by the first 2 questions and got to the third question on what my definition would look like for home sharing, I think it's definitely a person in the house. And you already heard one of my questions to Scott on what's a house? If I separate off my house and make it into 2 houses that still meets the city's definition of one dwelling, does that still put me in the house, even though they might be coming and going through a separate entrance? There's no kitchen. I know the zoning ordinance has a whole list of considerations there after kitchen, and interior lockable doors is only one of them. But I don't really know how that would be applied. Because I've already heard rumblings that people would take a large house and separate the house, keep it one dwelling. You would still then be able to run it as a home sharing operation, but you would have people independently coming and going. And I think that doesn't qualify for my picture. The young lady sitting there with the flower is my picture of a home sharing operation, the way she described it, always there. Somebody else described a home sharing operation a couple doors down where they're actually not present. Somebody else described it as I might be gone and there should be a management company in charge, but I'm home sharing. I don't think that's home sharing either. I think if you got to that question, it would definitely be somebody in the house. Just because I get to pontificate on this too, off on a tangent, I think in my opinion, the origination of TOT is that other than just the city's desire to drive revenues, is there's actually a burden that the city faces on tourism, and TOT helps us mitigate that burden. We have people coming and going. We have more than the residences using our infrastructure and our services, and that TOT then helps alleviate that. I don't think there's any nexus between the cottage industry of home sharing, as kind of we're trying to describe it, and TOT. My personal opinion is that home sharing, as I envision it, welcoming a foreign exchange student to an English school for 3 weeks into our house, let's use it as an example, and collecting money for that, I don't think that puts a burden on the city of Santa Barbara to the extent that somebody who's doing that should be paying TOT also. It doesn't rise to that level of the same type of consideration as a person running a hotel with and generating people and people and people constantly coming into town. I agree with the speakers that home sharing in particular is not very relevant to the loss of housing stock. I think home sharing actually has benefits to that, or it could have benefits. I know we're not talking about vacation rentals, but I have the opposite opinion on vacation rentals. I think it definitely affects housing stock. And I think that answers your questions. I could talk more about this, but I don't know that it answers your questions any better. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you. Commissioner Higgins, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Commissioner Jordan has his less is more hat on today, so that's nice. It suits him. But I could almost be convinced by what he was saying in pursuing that particular direction today. But I think since staff has asked us to maybe cast the net a little wider, I would say, just to answer the questions briefly, the first answer is yes. Second answer is B. And the third answer is no, with maybe a slight exception. So I'd be inclined to look at the home sharing ordinance in terms of a more permissive process than not, and perhaps the place to land is a tearing off process. So those home sharing sort of set of standards that we're after, that are described today, that are compelling, ought to be simply issued a business license with a certain list of standards, and if those fail, I hate to do this, but it meant because it sometimes makes things more complicated. But if you're, I guess I just don't think we want to overreach into people's constitutional rights that they currently have with their homes. I think the city of Santa Barbara's been down that path before, and we don't want to end up in court again. So the other issue is obviously overreaching with our planning department's resources, the city attorney's resources. So with something that might not be enforceable. But since we're just exploring this and this is concept level, it might be nice to see how we can be permissive with licensing, and then when complaints come in, licenses are revoked, and you're pointed in the direction of the planning department for a more extensive permitting process that could come with all of the bells and whistles that are associated with other performance permits or conditional use permits, like perhaps public noticing on the front end, obviously parking and other development standards that are associated with the increased use of the home, inspections, and perhaps even maintenance bonds or monitoring bonds in case the people that are supposed to be on the property aren't there, and it's fairly obvious that they're not. So sort of where I land on some of this stuff. Keeping in mind, I do like what Commissioner Jordan, where he's headed. I think he's got a more sort of holistic view of this. We can't do both, probably, but I'm open to hearing about how we might. I'm looking forward to hearing from staff as we spend some more time on this, a little bit more information about enforcement and staffing costs associated with not the VRBOs, which we know are not allowable, but maybe how some of these licenses would be monitored and what the enforcement and staffing costs would be associated with a more elaborate permit. I'm curious too as to if we're talking about platforms, we've heard from sort of local industry rep here, but some of the bigger platforms that you mentioned in the staff report, have they been consulted? That may be difficult to get their feedback on, but in terms of setting up a platform that would will their platforms interact with the nuances of our code? So if somebody goes into that national database, can that have some sort of level of customization that will answer all the questions that we need answered if this is going to be permissible? And again, I guess I'm still curious about what how staff is going to define what kind of evidence into the record as it relates to staff time, and really the evidence that will constitute a violation. So that's where I land. Thank you to all the speakers that came before us today. I live in a neighborhood where I don't have that particular problem, but I'm sensitive to those people that do have those problems. So I'd like to think we could address those here.
Thank you. Continuing on my left, Commissioner Lodge, your comments, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I'm going to start with the last question because that's an easy one to answer for me. Yes, the host should be present. It's because the host is present that you aren't going to have the problems of affecting the neighbors. If they're not there, then you have the opportunity, even though they may set all kinds of rules, as we've experienced with vacation rentals and the complaints we've heard. And I think there have been a lot more complaints that have not been officially filed and in some cases that's because the neighbors to these vacation rentals are afraid of retaliation. So there are more than just the few that have actually come through the city process. But the host needs to be present in order to make sure, obviously not every instant, but to make sure that an appropriate use of their home, the part of their home that they're renting, is maintained. And on two, I think perhaps a combination of A and B, perhaps leaning a little more toward A, that there do need to be standards for operation. Then the first question, is it worth pursuing? That's where I have problems because it seems it's so difficult to enforce the cities that have had them. On the other hand, I know how much people like being able to do homestays, not just the owners, but the people who come and stay. It's a very nice way for people to stay usually at a lower cost in a community and to have a more personal experience when they come visit. So I guess I would reluctantly say yes on one. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Schwartz, comments?
Mr. Campanella was first. I'll let him go first.
Okay. Commissioner Campanella.
Thank you. Let's see. As the concept we're pursuing, I say yes. I say yes, number one, where they match, being in the same zones and under the same conditions as vacation rentals. Okay, so I'm sort of bifurcating this out between where vacation rentals are currently allowed and where they're not, relative to my recommendations. So I'd say yes, and one of the reasons for yes, I think, is that it's a temporary use of a residence. It's one that can convert back based on seasonality. I think if a number of the letters we received, people wish to have their places open when their kids came back or when they went on vacation themselves, shut the house down. There are certain times that they would like to have people visiting them. So it gives flexibility. You don't permanently or even long-term change the use of the property as you would with a hotel, motel, or even a vacation rental that's owned for investment purposes. So I think it's a less intensive use impact, and I think it's also serving the use. We get statements from the city on transit occupancy taxes, and I don't know how this relates to occupancy. I had asked staff if we can find out the hotel, motel, city of Santa Barbara occupancy by month, how that works. And maybe that's available, maybe it's not. But based on TOT taxes, which is not a true picture because during your peak seasons, you may be charging more or not giving discounts. But during the summer, the total TOT taxes year to year, during the summer months are more than twice as high as they are during the winter months. And then fall and spring go somewhere in between, which means your peak demand, even accounting for differences in rates, obviously, perhaps, is during the summer months. Now, if you have the flexibility on home share to satisfy, I'm sorry, pardon me. Thank you, I will. That's why you're going last. Help me out here. If during those summer months you have some pressure release on the people that are coming into town, where temporarily the individuals who'd like to rent out a room can absorb some of the people who are coming in for out of town, it helps, of course, tourism, but maybe overall it helps the demand for new motels and hotels. You know, if you have some way to provide those residences, maybe there's less need for that product. And that product does get built in most zones, and in most zones, a lot of the zones where apartments can also be built. So, you know, maybe indirectly having home shares is helping the housing shortage in a way by not increasing the demand for hotel units because the seasonality in itself, there's some pressure release. Study required? Yes, absolutely. I'm not saying it's a definite, but from a development on the, it could be helping to relieve pressure to find more and more sites. When we get into residential neighborhoods, I guess I want to look at that one. I'm trying to look at that one maybe a little different. Although home share requires a home, if your districts, if you're matching it with the complete rental, vacation rental, a lot of the districts are manufacturing, commercial. There may not be a lot of single-family homes that would, or enough bedrooms that would nicely qualify and allow people to have some privacy within their own room, own bath, as you would in single-family houses in the R1, R2, R3 zone. So I'm trying to consider that as well. In light of the fact we have, like me, we have an aging population that may have a surplus of bedrooms, you know, in the community, or may have bedrooms that are available. So if we can accommodate part of our strains, whether it be workers, if people want to rent out more than 30 days in a room, or visitors, short-term, both the strains on us. And that possibly could help. So I think I'm open to the looking at the residential neighborhoods as well, but I really want to be cognizant of the fact that if we do go there, that it's going to really be incumbent on the house owners to be more protective of the neighborhood than they even would be if they have a month-to-month lease, because they're under the microscope. Okay? Now, even though they may be renting to 3 individuals, 3 bedrooms, which is, I believe, Mr. Vincent is considered a family in the city of Santa Barbara, so groups are considered families. So you can rent to a group, you can rent to an individual more than 30 days, but if we're going to allow someone to do it less than 30 days, like I said, it's going to be incumbent on them to really make sure that there's no nuisances to the other residences in the area, which is the purpose of the zoning of R1, R2, R3. And by that I mean, yes, you've got to be there. If you say you're a host and you like people and you want flexibility, you need to be there. And number 2, business license and registration, absolutely. I think following the rules, losing it if there's a complaint is important. Plus, thirdly, I think the platforms that are renting right now, and I saw this on one platform, they're pretty cognizant of the rules as they're changing in the city of Santa Barbara. And there's a page on one of the websites for Santa Barbara that warns potential customers that there are changes going on. Contact community development. You know, you may not be allowed this or you may not be allowed that. So with the knowledge that this is required for homestay, I think working with the platforms, it's going to be noticed to the people that want to rent for that short period of time. And I think people should be noticed and have the notice that are coming in that we are examining these places. It is safe to say. It is within the law, rather than the confusion that may have been set to date, like what is the law and what can I do? I'm not going. And maybe it would be a little more competitive even at the Santa Monica, because maybe we sort of encourage it a little bit under the right conditions. So again, I think there's some benefits to it. I'd even go into the single-family zoning, assuming that we really control it. So I would be yes on 1. I would be business license and registration definitely on 2. And I would be definite on number 3, which is yes, that the host has to be there. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Schwartz now.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, this isn't a courtesy review. This potential ordinance amendment needed to come to the Planning Commission, and I did not hear that there was a 5-2 council support for this, a supermajority. So it'll be interesting when it goes back if there has been any shift at all among 5 of the members who need to vote for this on council. Having said that, let's start with number 1. To me, I want to bifurcate for a moment. There's the concept of home sharing, and then there's whether home sharing should be pursued in Santa Barbara. And to me, those need to be separated because for me personally, I'm in support of a concept of home sharing. I have personally experienced it, and many people I know have, both domestically and internationally. But that's not my job. My job is here in the city of Santa Barbara, and it's to look out over the entire city, the diversity of our residents, our business owners, in every sector, and to balance, and that's a key word for this Planning Commission, is to balance policies, uses, needs, and so forth. So with that in mind, I want to say that I'm hesitant to support home sharing in Santa Barbara, and I want to, but again, we will not be the decision makers for that, so obviously it will be at council. I want to make a few remarks as to why I'm hesitant, or why I might have kind of a tepid support, so to speak. And I'm picking up on a number of comments from members of the public, both from the letters that we've received, and I've read every one of them, and thank you for being here today. I really have taken to heart everything that's been said sort of on both sides of the ledger regarding this issue. If I had heard more homeowners, property owners who are sharing their homes, wanting to or having a track record or a history of sharing their homes commercially with those who are working in Santa Barbara, seniors, other seniors in Santa Barbara that are finding it very difficult to remain housed and to remain in Santa Barbara, I think that I might be a little more empathetic. But when I think of what sounds to me like the primary driver between less than 30-day home share, it definitely sounds like, feels like, looks like a commercial use to me. And I don't see it outside of pure tourism. I'll get to that in a moment. I don't see it benefiting on balance all of the other needs, the dire needs that we have in Santa Barbara. When we talk about the transient occupancy tax and business license fees and how important they are as a baseline of revenue for the city, what hasn't been discussed, which I want to point out on the other side, is the hundreds of millions of dollars that the taxpayers in Santa Barbara County will have to fork over to widen Highway 101 to bring workers into Santa Barbara who don't and can't live here. So it's not just the revenue side, it's the payment side. We have to look at both sides, I think, eyes wide open, and factually to ask ourselves on balance, how do we try to accommodate as much as possible in this very constrained area of land that we have between the ocean and the mountains, and we're already 90% built out, and with about 61% of our residents being renters, that is the other factor, I think, for us to consider. So the types of home sharing that I've heard, both in the letters and from the public today, don't give me a sense that there's an interest or a commitment in renting to those who have been working here, who are working here, who have been working and want to retire here, or seniors who have been here a long time and cannot afford to live on their own any longer. I personally receive the calls from desperate people in the community looking for housing who are longtime Santa Barbarans. I'm involved in the nonprofit sector in a number of ways, and I'm acutely aware, for example, with the Housing Authority City of Santa Barbara, we have a 10,000 to 11,000 wait list of those who are desperately trying to find permanent, longer-term housing. So to try to look at the tourism industry as the more important factor here, I think, is not only an oversight, but I'm going to say strongly, this is how I feel, that I think it would be irresponsible of me to just look at the tourism aspect. Councilmember Hart has raised the issue of housing a number of times in public, and that resonates with me. I also want to say that the proliferation of the English language schools and the short-term residential needs of those students in our community, clearly, along with City College, and some members of the public talked about this, those factors are also adding to the housing inventory pressures. Certainly, it's not just either short-term vacation rentals or home sharing or house stays. We have, there's sort of a broader matrix of pressures on our housing inventory but what's coming to the fore are all of these together, kind of bearing down on our limited housing resources, our limited land use. A couple of other thoughts regarding some comments from members of the public. I think that if we do go down this path, and again, it will be council's decision, this has to be the most robust, permitting, proactive, yes, proactive, not reactive, complaint-based, monitoring and enforcement program I've ever seen in the city. I don't know how I could support anything other than that, because if we tell our community that we're serious, both on the plus side and understanding the positive deficit side of going in this new policy direction, we are responsible. The buck will stop with us in terms of making sure that the permits go in place, that we're monitoring to number 3, yes, the hosts, and I would actually then ask staff to put together quite an extensive list of all the definitions that need to be very clearly defined. And I'm looking at the first page of our staff report. Home, resident, hosts, visitors. We have dwelling. This is just one of a number of them. So that we in the community are clear, again, should the council go in this direction, that we have properly permitted, we are properly monitoring, and in fact proactively monitoring. And for those who are out of compliance, there's a very swift is difficult with our processes for a number of reasons. Because we, as Ms. Brooke mentioned, we have to conduct due diligence on these complaints or where we have some evidence of something being out of compliance, somebody being out of compliance. All of that's going to require that here again on the expense side, not the TOT and business license revenue side, we are going to have to beef up, I'm guessing, both planning and city attorney office resources for all of this. That means all of us pay for that. All of us pay for that. So if council decides to go in this direction, I think there are many issues, including the specific zones to allow this to occur. Won't talk about that today. If it comes back to Planning Commission, we'll talk more about that at that time. Now, on that note, I want to make a couple of comments. I want to mention the 30-day issue. I don't know if 30 days, I know this would require significant municipal code research, search and replace for changes to other aspects of our municipal code. I don't know if 30 days is the right number. You know, I think staff and city attorney will have to wrestle with that. Less than 29 days versus 30 or 31, I don't see the difference, so I'm not sure what to make of that, if that's the right number. I want to mention that I think that some of these quantifiable requirements, they're page 4 of our staff report. You have the number of rentals allowed in our city in its entirety, by zones, separation between vacation rentals. There's a whole list that staff put together for us under the topic of performance standards. I think all of that needs to be very thoroughly vetted. I'm very concerned, I'll just say in the end, host is much too open and generalized a term for me. I think if somebody owns a property and they are in good faith committing to remain there, I don't mean 24/7, you've got to go out and have your life and so forth, but I think the owner or owners need to be present, not delegating it to a friend or an out-of-town family member who comes in periodically. I think it's that level of seriousness and rigor that needs to be applied. So host doesn't do it for me in terms of the category. So I think that's it for now. Again, if this comes back to us, I think there'll be much more to comment on. So those would be that would be my input back to council. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'll make a few brief comments. First off, obviously there's, in my opinion, a big difference between out-of-town property owners that are running vacation rentals and a local homeowner who's running a home sharing rental. And I think the council made the right decision to say that the out-of-town people that bought properties to rent out as a vacation renter is not what we want in the city. But the idea that vacation rentals or home sharing rentals are going to go away, that's not going to happen. So the main concern then is how do we kind of work with people to make it the best for both. So in answer to your first question there, is the concept worth pursuing, a home sharing concept? Yes, it is. And since it will continue anyway, we ought to do what we can to try to work with people. And I think there's a very simple way that we can do it. We already allow home occupations in residential zones. And a home sharing, if you look at it, meets our current definition for home occupation. So I think it'd be very simple to add it to the list of business license businesses, and as long as we verify that the home is owned by the person that's applying, I don't see any issue with having it in a residential zone as a home occupation, which we already allow. We allow accountants, tax preparers, architects, so on and so forth in residential zones. So just add it to the list. As far as should the host be present, I would say yes, but I would also say that it won't be enforceable. We can't be proactive enough to have a staff member outside of every home sharing house to log people in and out 24/7. So the fact that you have it as a requirement when somebody applies for a business license will enable you to have a little more leverage to deal with the few recalcitrant people that continually rent to problem people. And if the police are called because of a problem and the host isn't there, that goes on the record when it comes time for a business license renewal. If there's a few of those cases where the host wasn't there, then they don't get their business license anymore. I think it's pretty simple. I would caution you against going up the road of having a whole lot of requirements. You can do this, you can't do that, you have to do this. The more things you put in there, the more difficult it's going to be to enforce. The more complicated it's going to be, the more staff time, and the more difficult it's going to be for everybody to understand and to be enforceable. So keep it simple and deal with it at the simplest level as we can, which, in my opinion, would be make it an allowed home occupation. So I'll ask staff, do you have any further comments? Did you get enough? Do you want more information from any of the commissioners?
No, Mr. Chair, I believe on our side we are good. We do appreciate your time and the thought you put into this. It's very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, and as I mentioned, for anybody that wants to review it, it's supposed to be up on the city website this evening. Okay, we'll move along to our administrative agenda at this point. Staff hearing officer liaison reports.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple meetings to report on. The only item of interest was actually yesterday's meeting, which was a three-story house in the 1200 block of West Mitchell Terreno, which is right up against the hillside and it's part of the lot is a 75% grade, which is a pretty big number. But it actually had been before the Planning Commission maybe back in 2008 for a similar project. This project was more square footage but less building envelope, and was very interestingly engineered, and Ms. Reardon did a great job of walking through the project and talking the requirements through, and it was approved. And I hesitated to drive by because I really didn't want to see a 75% slope, what that really meant. But that was really the only one of note.
Okay, thank you. Any committee and liaison reports? Commissioner Schwartz?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, Monday of this week, I attended the Water Commission meeting. A few highlights. Staff has been looking into what's called an automated metering infrastructure technology system, and obviously that would allow for quick capture, digital retention, and also almost real-time online access to water use, both by the city and our water users. Well, the price tag for that complete conversion is between $6 and $7 million. So at this point, staff is not recommending a complete overhaul, but a pilot project is probably what Ms. Taylor of the Water Resources Group is going to move forward with. That's much more manageable financially, and we can see if we can kind of move into the 21st century or maybe 22nd century by the time we get to that. There also is a new job requisition that Kelly Dyer just sent me this morning out of that group. I think it's called an Administrative Analyst 1 and 2. It's really a water supply analyst position, and staff is looking to fill that very quickly by November 11th. So if anybody's interested, please go on the city's website and apply as soon as possible. Regarding the desal plant, some in the community may have noticed that starting September 21st, demolition began on the property, so that project is underway. And regardless of El Nino, both the council and staff have the committed resources along with the consultant contract to move that forward. Chair of the Water Commission, Barry Keller, attended an international desal conference down in San Diego recently and reported back, I think to many's shock, that, as he put it, there isn't one desal plant known globally to use subsurface intake today. Now, I spoke with Chair Keller after the meeting. He said, well, maybe there's one in Saudi Arabia that kind of looks like a subsurface intake technology, but probably not to our standards. So, as Mr. Jordan remarked, who's one of the commissioners now, it sounds like that the city of Santa Barbara, on the one hand, I could say is on the cutting edge. On the other hand, I could say is being required to move ahead with a study and technology consideration that hasn't been done anywhere else in the world. So we'll see how that turns out. Lastly, on a very positive note from Madeline Ward, just to remind everybody in the city, there are free shower heads, and you can go to 630 Garden Street. There is no cost. There is no limit to how many you can pick up, and so that could help with everybody's water conservation. Additionally, we're doing still very well in terms of overall community conservation, and staff gave a kudos to the city, and we don't know how much more conserving we can be. We're really getting down to it being a very difficult task to conserve more than we are. It's really sort of on a property by property basis. But so good news, and lots of people hoping for a wet El Nino, but in the meantime, we're planning for the continued drought. Lastly, I even asked Mr. Hagmark about is there such a thing as a stage 4, and he says we're not even going there right now. So stage 4 drought declaration and regulations. So I think that's it for this month, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Lodge.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The last meeting of the Historic Landmarks Commission, there was a report from Parks and Recreation on a history project that they've done on the 5 oldest parks in Santa Barbara, and the oldest is Alameda and which was followed by Orpet. Both were intended as places to have many different varieties of trees, and some of them exist from then. Dr. Doremus was involved, was the first park superintendent, and he was involved in planting them, and they're over 100 years old, and they're still going. They wanted to do this report and an analysis of what's there in those parks to make sure that they are maintained as well as possible and to replace where necessary and so on. But the report is available online on Parks and Recreation website. Thank you.
Okay. Seeing no other reports, the meeting will be adjourned till the October 29th joint meeting with the Transportation Circulation Committee. Thank you all.
Even I can't explain